A truck driver in Amarillo walks past his own rig, steps into a back room, and fills a plastic cup while a stranger stands listening at the door. He has done nothing wrong. The reason he is standing there begins with a train. Before the cup, the pills were the job. Not a secret, not a scandal. Infrastructure. From the 1940s on, Benzedrine and Dexedrine moved freight the way diesel and rubber did. A man handed a load in Los Angeles, and a delivery window in Chicago did not sleep his way there. He medicated the miles. Long-haul drivers had their own name for Dexedrine. They called it West Coast Turnaround because it could keep a man awake all the way to the coast and back without stopping for the night. The drug carried a trucker's nickname because trucking was one of its biggest markets. This was not a handful of bad apples in the 80s. This was how the hours got run for 40 years, right out in the open. And the reason a man reached for them was not weakness. It was arithmetic. He was paid by the mile, not by the hour. So every hour asleep was an hour unpaid. He had a dispatcher pushing a delivery time, a shipper who did not care how far away the last load had left him, and a paper logbook that everyone, the driver, the carrier, the man who audited it, quietly understood to be a work of fiction. The book said one thing. The road demanded another. The pill was how you closed the distance between them. So when the testing came, it did not feel like a rule changing. It felt like a way of life ending. And the strange part, the part almost nobody behind the wheel remembers correctly, is that it did not begin with a trucking safety report at all. It began with the drug war. On September 15, 1986, President Reagan signed an executive order titled Drug-Free Federal Workplace. Read its own language, and you will not find highway safety anywhere in it. It speaks of the profits from illegal drugs as the single greatest source of income for organized crime. It was aimed at federal employees, the people on the government payroll, as one front in a national campaign. But it did something quieter and more lasting than any speech. It built the machine, the certified laboratories, the chain of custody paperwork, the collection rules, right down to a stranger standing outside the stall. Every piece of the ritual that driver in Amarillo would one day walk through was written first for a clerk in a federal office. There was only one problem. A trucker is not a federal employee. So how did the machine reach him? It reached him through a train. Late in the afternoon on January 4, 1987, outside Chase, Maryland, an Amtrak passenger train running north came around a curve at speed and struck a set of Conrail locomotives that had rolled straight past a stop signal and onto the main line. 16 people were killed. More than 170 were injured. It was, at the time, the deadliest crash in Amtrak's history. When investigators pulled the Conrail engineer, Ricky Gates, from the wreckage, they learned he had been running his locomotives past those signals while impaired by marijuana. He went to prison for 4 years. That crash did what a decade of policy papers could not. It put a face on the idea of a man operating heavy machinery while high, and it put that face on the evening news. The overhaul it set in motion became, 4 years later, the Omnibus Transportation Employee Testing Act of 1991, a single federal law that reached across aviation, rail, transit, and trucking all at once. The trucker was not pulled into the cup for anything a trucker had done. He was pulled in because of a stoned engineer on a railroad he had never worked for. One crash, one law, every mode. But there was still a question nobody in a cab was asking, and it was the largest one of all. Was any of this legal? Testing a man who is stone sober, who is given no cause, who is suspected of nothing, pulling him aside on a random draw and demanding a sample of his body, is not a small thing under American law. For most of the country's history, the government could not search you that way without a reason. Then came a case called Skinner versus the Railway Labor Executives Association. On March 21, 1989, the Supreme Court ruled 7-2 that it could. It was the first time the court had ever upheld that kind of bodily search of workers with no warrant and no suspicion of any individual wrongdoing. The majority carved out what it called a special needs exception for safety-sensitive work. The safety of the public, it held, outweighed the privacy of the man. In dissent, Justices Marshall and Brennan warned that the first casualty of the war on drugs would be the liberties of ordinary citizens. Notice what that case was about: not trucks. Railroads, again. The legal ground that random testing of truck drivers now stands on was broken open by a railroad case. The men in the cabs inherited a precedent written for the men on the rails. By now, you would expect the safety numbers to be overwhelming. The whole apparatus, the order, the law, the ruling, rested on the premise that America's trucks were full of drug-impaired drivers. So in 1990, the National Transportation Safety Board ran the study meant to prove it. Investigators examined 182 crashes across 8 states over a single year, and these were a particular kind, the ones that killed the driver himself, where a man ran off the road or rolled his own rig. The study was built to measure alcohol and drugs. That is not what it found at the top. The single most frequently cited cause was not a drug. It was fatigue, named in 31% of those crashes, ahead of alcohol and every other drug combined, which together came in at 29%. And the drug use it did find lined up with one thing in particular: the drivers running illegal hours were the same drivers taking the pills. The toxicology said it plainly. About a third of the drivers had a psychoactive drug or alcohol in their blood. Marijuana and alcohol each turned up in roughly 13%. Amphetamines or methamphetamine, cousins of the old West Coast turnaround, in about 7%. The government went hunting for drug-crazed truckers. What it found, in its own data, were exhausted men self-medicating a schedule no human body could keep. The pills were not the disease. They were the symptom. The disease was the clock. None of it slowed the rollout. The Federal Highway Administration phased the testing in on schedule, the largest carriers first in 1995, and every remaining carrier by January of 1996, with alcohol testing brought in a step behind the drugs. The study had pointed at the clock. The cup went after the men. And once it was bolted into the job, it never came back out. Then, decades on, the numbers did something nobody had planned for. For years, the random testing rate for commercial drivers sat at 50%, half the workforce, pulled at random every year. Then the positives began to fall. For 3 straight years, from 2011 through 2013, fewer than 1% of drivers tested positive. The deterrent looked like it had worked. So in 2016, the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration cut the rate in half down to 25%, and told carriers it would spare them around $50 million a year in testing they no longer had to run. Then the numbers came back. By 2018, the positive rate had climbed to 1% again, and the rule reversed itself, back up to 50% in 2020, where it sits today. Only now the drug at the center is not a stimulant that keeps a man awake for the run. It is marijuana, which accounts for roughly 60% of every positive test, colliding state by state with the same substance being legalized down the road. And the men themselves. More than 150,000 commercial license holders now sit in a federal registry, flagged, barred from touching a truck until they finish a return process that many of them never do. The schedule that created the demand never went anywhere. The pills only changed names, and by the government's own count, the thing the cup was built to win is still not being won.